3 weeks after they buried Mirabel Halverson under the cottonwoods at the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, the feed truck stopped at the cattle guard and would not cross. The driver kept his hands on the wheel. The engine idled. And Elias Halverson, 58 years old, stood in the spring mud of his own ranch yard, holding a delivery slip that asked for $38,420 in cash today, before a single bale of hay would touch his soil. Behind him, 1,400 merino sheep waited for food that was not coming. In front of him, the snow on the Sapphire Mountains was melting too fast. And across the section road in a pearl-white Lincoln with the engine running, sat a man who had waited 36 years for this exact moment to arrive. If you've ever stood alone in a place that used to hold the sound of someone you loved, stay with me tonight. This is a slow story told gently, the way old shepherds tell stories beside a stove. Settle in, let the lamp dim, and if you find comfort in tales of quiet, stubborn people who refuse to be erased, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so the next story can find its way to you when the night gets long. Now, let me take you back to that morning in April on a ranch called Stillwater Fold, in a corner of Montana where the wind still carries the smell of lanolin and pine. The driver of the feed truck was a man named Lyle Penrose. Eli had known him since the 7th grade, back when they used to share a thermos of coffee on the bus to school basketball games in Hamilton. Lyle would not look him in the eye now. He stared at the dashboard the way men stare at funerals, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out the way a creek sounds when it freezes from the bottom up. Eli, I'm sorry. The co-op pulled all the credit lines last night. No more net 60. No more harvest settlement, cashier's check or nothing. Eli folded the slip in half, then in half again. The paper made a soft sound like a moth against a window. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in 3 weeks, not since the highway patrol came to his door at 4 in the morning and told him about the black ice on the switchback above Lost Horse Canyon, and the way Mirabel's little blue Subaru had gone over the guardrail and come to rest in the trees, the headlights still burning when they found her, the wedding ring still on her finger, the leather notebook she carried everywhere still tucked beneath the passenger seat. He had not raised his voice for the doctor who explained the autopsy. He had not raised it for the funeral director who asked about caskets. He had not raised it for the women from the Methodist church who came with casseroles, or for the men at the Grange Hall who shook his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He simply nodded at Lyle Penrose, and he handed the slip back through the window, and he said, "Then take it home, Lyle. Take it home and tell the co-op that Stillwater Fold does not beg." Lyle started to speak. Eli was already turning away. He walked across the yard with his hands in the pockets of his canvas coat. The coat had been a Christmas present from Mirabel 11 winters ago. She had stitched his initials into the inside collar, where no one but him would ever see them. He could feel the threads against the back of his neck. Now the same way he could feel her absence in the kitchen window of the farmhouse, where her coffee cup still sat beside the sink, still half full, still bearing the faint print of a lower lip on the rim. He had not washed the cup. He could not bring himself to wash the cup. Across the road, the door of the pearl-white Lincoln opened. The man who stepped out wore a felt Stetson that looked like it had never been rained on, and a leather coat the color of bourbon, and the soft, slow smile of a man who has come to collect on a debt that the other man did not know he owed. His name was Thaddeus Coltrane. He owned 21,000 acres between Hamilton and Derby. He owned the largest sheep operation in the Western Valley. He owned half the seats on the co-op board. He owned the bank president's golf membership. And once a long time ago in the summer of 1989, he had owned the belief that a young accountant named Mirabel Whitfield was going to marry him. She had not. She had married Eli Halverson instead. And Thad Coltrane had carried that fact in his coat pocket for 36 years, the way some men carry a knife. Eli Thad called, crossing the ditch in boots that had never seen real work. I wish this wasn't happening so soon after your loss. Eli stopped at the bottom step of the farmhouse porch. He did not turn all the way around. He gave Thad his shoulder, which was the most he could give. I came to offer something honest, Thad went on. His voice was the voice of a man reading a sympathy card. The market's against you. The co-op's against you. 1,400 sheep, no feed contract, no lambing help, no wife to keep the books. I'll buy the whole place at 20% above appraisal. Cash. You walk away with enough to retire in Bozeman. Buy a little cabin near your boy in Denver. Live out your days in peace. Eli still did not turn. I know what she meant to you, Thad said, quieter now, almost gentle, almost kind, the way a wolf is almost a dog. But she meant something to me too, Eli. You know that. She was going to be mine before you came along with your sheepdog and your father's broken-down ranch, and that voice she said sounded like a river. He paused. Let me have what's left of her. I'll be a better steward than you. Eli turned then, slowly, the way a man turns who has spent the last 3 weeks not raising his voice. She was never yours, Thad. Not for a single hour of a single day. She didn't choose me over you. She chose herself. She just happened to find me on the way. Thad's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes shifted. He held out a thick cream envelope. The offer's good through Friday. After that, the bank will start the foreclosure paperwork themselves. I'd rather you took the money than the shame. Eli did not take the envelope. He let it hang in the air between them until Thad finally lowered his arm. You know where to find me, Thad said. And he walked back across the ditch with the same unhurried stride he had carried since high school, when he had been the boy who always got the prize except once. Eli stood on the porch a long time after the Lincoln drove away. The wind moved through the cottonwoods at the edge of the lane, and the bells on the lead ewes rang faintly from the lambing pen. And somewhere down by the creek, a meadowlark made the first true song of spring. He took the cream envelope from where Thad had tucked it onto the porch rail, walked it around to the burn barrel behind the woodshed, struck a kitchen match from the box he kept on the lintel, and watched the offer curl into black flakes that rose up against a pale Montana sky. Then he went inside to face the part of the day he had been dreading more than the feed truck. He had to open Mirabel's books. The farmhouse was quiet in the way only an empty house can be quiet. There was the tick of the wall clock his father had built in 1962. There was the creak of the floorboards by the wood stove. There was the soft, unbearable absence of a second pair of slippers by the back door. Eli stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where she had paid every bill, balanced every ledger, ordered every spool of wool yarn for the small dye house behind the barn that had been her pride and her secret patience for 30 years. He had never opened her books, not once. He had been the man of the pastures, the shears, the lambing nights, the fence wire. She had been the woman of the numbers, the orders, the looms, the quiet calculations that kept Stillwater Fold afloat through 3 droughts and a wool crash. And the year the coyotes came down from the high country in pairs. Now her chair was empty, and the bills were his. He sat down. He pulled the ledger toward him. He opened it to the last page she had written in 3 days before her accident. Her handwriting was the same handwriting that had been on his school lunch notes when they were 19 years old. The same handwriting that had signed their marriage license at the courthouse in Missoula. The same handwriting that had written, "I'll wait" up at the bottom of every grocery list for 33 years. Wool remembers what wire forgets. She had written across the top of the page just under the date. He did not know what it meant. He had never asked. There were 1,000 things he had never asked her. He read until the light failed. By the time he closed the ledger, he understood 3 things. The first was that Mirabel had been quietly, methodically, terrifyingly competent. The second was that the ranch had been running closer to the edge than he had ever guessed, because the wool market had been falling for 2 years, and she had been making up the difference by selling small lots of handspun yarn to specialty buyers in Bozeman and Missoula lots. She had never mentioned to him lots she had labeled in her ledger with little drawings of trees and stars. And the third was that the cash reserve she had been building for him, in case anything ever happened to her, had been wiped out 3 months ago by a hospital bill he had not known existed. He turned back to that entry. February. A clinic in Hamilton. Cardiology consult. $4,000. Paid in full. No insurance claim, no reimbursement, no mention to him. She had known. Some part of her had known her heart was not well, and she had not told him. She had paid the bill out of the egg money and the yarn money, and she had folded the receipt into the back of the ledger as if it were a grocery list. And she had gone on making him coffee every morning and laughing at his bad jokes every evening and dying quietly inside her own chest without letting him carry the weight of it. Eli put his head down on the table beside the ledger, and he wept the way men of his generation weep, which is to say almost silently, with his shoulders shaking and his fist pressed against his mouth, while the wall clock ticked and the wood stove sighed, and somewhere outside in the dusk, a ewe called for her lamb, and the lamb answered. When he could breathe again, he stood up. He washed his face in the kitchen sink, and he did the thing he had been avoiding for 3 weeks. He walked out across the yard in the blue evening light to the small wooden building behind the lambing barn that had been Mirabel's dye house and weaving studio. He had not opened the door since the morning of the funeral. The key was on a nail beside the frame. He turned it. The door swung inward on hinges she had oiled herself, and the smell that came out was the smell of her life. Lanolin, cedar shavings, madder root, indigo, the faint mineral note of well water, the drowsy sweetness of beeswax. 40 different colors of wool hung in coils from the rafters like the inside of a sunset. He stood on the threshold and could not for a long moment step inside. When he finally did, he moved slowly the way a man moves through a church he has not entered since his confirmation. He passed the spinning wheel she had inherited from her grandmother. He passed the great oak loom that filled the back wall, still strung with a half-finished length of charcoal gray twill. He passed the wooden bench where she had sat 10,000 hours of her life, the seat worn smooth and dark in the exact shape of her. And then he saw something he had never noticed in 30 years of glancing into this room from the doorway. The bench had a drawer beneath it, a shallow wooden drawer with a brass pull no bigger than a thimble. He had walked past that bench 5,000 times. He had carried her coffee out to her on cold mornings. He had stood in the doorway and watched her weave on summer evenings, and he had never once seen the drawer, because the bench was always tucked into the shadow of the loom, and her skirt was always covering the front of it, and she had wanted it that way. He knelt down. His knee popped. He pulled the brass thimble. Inside the drawer was a single leather notebook, the color of old saddle soft from handling the cover stained dark with something that looked like beeswax and smelled like the lanolin of 1,000 fleeces. The leather had been hand-tooled with 5 words pressed into the front in the same neat letters she had used on his initials 30 Christmases ago. Wool remembers what wire forgets. He opened it. Eli, the first page said, "If you are reading this, I have gone on ahead of you, and I am sorry to leave you with the books. I am sorry to leave you with the sheep. I am sorry to leave you with the silence. But I have left you something else as well hidden in these pages, and you will find it if you trust me one more time. Cut the rope before it strangles the lamb, my love. Count the sheep backward. Start with what you want to keep. The rest will follow." He sat down on the floor of the dye house with his back against her bench, and he read until the moon came up over the sapphires. It was not a journal. It was a war plan written in a wife's hand, drawn out over what must have been 3 or 4 years of quiet evenings, while he had been out lambing or mending fence and thought she was just knitting by the stove. She had mapped the slow tightening of the noose around small ranches like theirs. The way the co-op had absorbed every independent feed supplier in the county. The way the bank had tied credit to the co-op. The way Coltrane Livestock had bought up the trucking. The way the commodity wool market in Boston was dying every year. The way the only sheep ranches surviving west of the Mississippi were either too big to fail or too strange to compete with. And then she had drawn in patient pencil a third way. She had a plan for a small hand-finished direct-to-consumer wool brand, not commodity fleece sold by the pound to faceless brokers. Not even the small yarn lots she had quietly been moving for the last 5 years. Something bigger. A line of merino cashmere blend yarn spun from a small crossbred flock she had been quietly developing in the back pasture for 7 years without ever telling him what she was doing. Plant dyed with Bitterroot Valley roots and barks, hand skeined in the studio. Sold by name with a story to high-end knitting shops and small fashion houses in Portland, Asheville, Bozeman, and Brooklyn. Premium price, premium margin, no co-op, no middleman, no leash. The math was on the next page. He stared at it for a long time. 600 ewes of the right kind, properly managed, could net more than 1,400 of the wrong kind. The capital cost was almost nothing, because she had been building the equipment one used piece at a time for a decade. The bottleneck was labor. The bottleneck was hands. The bottleneck, she had written in the margin in tiny letters, is going to be you, Eli. You will have to ask Caleb to come home. He closed the notebook and put his forehead against the cool leather of the cover. Caleb, their only son, 31 years old now, a software engineer in Denver. 5 years and 4 months since he had last walked into the kitchen at Stillwater Fold. 5 years and 4 months since the fight in this very yard, the fight Eli had replayed in his head every night before sleep. The fight in which Eli had told his son that a man who left a Montana ranch for an office chair was a man who did not understand what his great-grandfather had buried in this soil. And Caleb had told his father that a man who could not see his own son for who he was had no business being called a father at all. They had not spoken since. Mirabel had been the one to call him on his birthdays. Mirabel had been the one to send him hand-knitted socks every winter. Mirabel had been the one to keep the door open from her end of the kitchen telephone, while Eli had sat in the next room pretending not to listen. He did not know how to ask Caleb to come home. He did not know if Caleb would answer the phone. He did not know if the boy even knew his mother was dead, because Eli had let Pastor Eunice Marlowe make all the calls, and he had not asked which ones she had been able to reach. He stood up. His back ached. The moon was high. He carried the notebook into the kitchen and laid it on the table beside the ledger. He poured himself a cup of cold coffee from the pot Mirabel had loved, the green enamel pot that had been her grandmother's. He sat down, and he was lifting the cup to his lips when a pair of headlights swung off the county road and came slowly up the long gravel lane to the house. He set the cup down. He listened. It was not the rumble of Thad Coltrane's Lincoln. It was a smaller engine, a rental car, by the sound of it hesitating at every rut in the drive. The car came to a stop in front of the porch. The engine cut. A door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed the gravel. Slow ones, uncertain ones. Footsteps that did not know if they had the right to be there. Eli stood up from the kitchen table. He walked to the back door. He turned on the porch light. A young man was standing at the bottom of the steps with a duffel bag at his feet. He had Mirabel's eyes. He had her chin. He had the long, thoughtful mouth she used to chew on when she was working a difficult equation. He was thinner than Eli remembered. There were threads of gray at his temples already at 31, and Eli felt that gray land in his chest like a stone dropped into a deep well. Caleb did not say hello. He looked at the porch light. He looked at the door. He looked at his father. "Pastor Marlowe called me," he said. His voice was the voice of a boy who had become a stranger. "She said you weren't going to call me yourself." "I wasn't," Eli said. He could not lie to his son even now. Caleb nodded once the way men nod when a thing they expected has been confirmed. Then he picked up the duffel bag, and he came up the steps, and he stopped on the top step, looking past his father into the lit kitchen, where the green enamel coffee pot sat on the stove, and the leather notebook lay open on the table, and Mirabel's slippers were still by the back door, where she had stepped out of them on the morning of the day she died. He saw the slippers. His face broke for 1 second, just one the way ice breaks on a pond in March. And then he put it back together. "I'm not here for you," he said quietly. "I'm here to help you sell this place. I'll stay a week. We'll find a buyer. You'll move into town. Mom would have wanted you safe." Eli looked at his son. Then he looked back at the table, at the leather notebook with its hand-tooled words gleaming softly in the lamplight, at the words his wife had pressed into the cover with her own thumb. Wool remembers what wire forgets. He turned back to Caleb. "Come inside, son," he said. "Your mother left us a letter, and before you decide what we're selling, I think you ought to read it." Caleb stood very still on the top step in the cold spring night. Somewhere out in the dark, the bells of the lead-yews rang once, then again, a small, clear sound carried on the wind off the sapphires. He looked at his father for a long moment, and then, without a word, he stepped past Eli and into the warm yellow light of his mother's kitchen, and the door closed behind them both. Out on the county road, half a mile down toward Hamilton, a pearl-white Lincoln sat parked at the shoulder with its lights off. The man inside it watched the porch light at Stillwater Fold burn against the dark, and he watched the second figure climb the steps, and he reached for his telephone in the cup holder and dialed a number he had memorized a long time ago. When the voice on the other end answered, he said only 4 words very softly into the receiver. "The boy came home." Then he hung up. And he sat there in the dark for a long time, watching the light in the kitchen window of the only ranch in the Bitterroot Valley he had never been able to buy. Caleb did not sleep in his old bedroom that first night. He slept on the couch in the front room with his shoes still on his back to the wall, the way a man sleeps in a place he is trying to convince himself he has not arrived in. The leather notebook stayed on the kitchen table where his father had left it. Caleb had not opened it. He had said he would read it in the morning. Eli had not pressed. Eli himself sat awake in the rocking chair by the wood stove until the eastern sky over the sapphires turned the color of pale milk. He did not read the notebook again either. He did not need to. He had read enough to know that the path Mirabel had drawn was a path that asked more of him than he had asked of himself in 20 years. He was a man who could shear a ewe in 90 seconds. He could deliver a breech lamb in a snowstorm. He could mend a barbed wire fence in the dark. He had never, in his life, sold a single skein of yarn to a stranger. He had never written a description of a color. He had never spoken on a telephone to a buyer from a city. He had never built a website or photographed a fleece or shipped a package across a state line. The notebook was telling him to do all of those things, and it was telling him to do them with a son who had come home only to bury the place he stood in. Just before sunrise, Eli got up from the chair, put on his coat, and walked out to the lambing barn to do the only thing he still knew how to do without being taught. He fed the sheep. He counted them. He marked 3 ewes who were close to dropping. He pulled a tick from the ear of the old lead doe Mirabel had named Constance the year Caleb was born. The sun came up over the eastern ridge, slow and pink, and the barn filled with the small wet sounds of animals chewing and Eli let the work do for him what no words could do. When he came back in, Caleb was standing barefoot at the kitchen sink, washing the green enamel coffee pot with the same careful slowness a man uses to handle a relic. He had taken off his city clothes. He was wearing one of Eli's old flannel shirts, the dark green one with the missing top button which Mirabel had set out on the spare bed years ago in case the boy ever came home in a hurry and needed something warm. The shirt hung loose on him. He had not turned around when Eli came in. "The slippers," Caleb said without looking up. "Where do you want me to put them?" Eli stopped in the doorway. The mud on his boots dripped onto the rag rug. "Leave them," he said. Caleb's shoulders rose and fell. "I read the notebook," he said. Eli waited. "I don't agree with it," Caleb said. He turned off the water. He dried his hands on the towel Mirabel had embroidered with a row of small white sheep, a towel that had hung on that same hook for 19 years. "But I'll give you the week I promised, and I'll give you one more week after that if at the end of the first one I think Mom was right, and you have any chance at all." He turned around then. His face was very still. "After 2 weeks, if I think you can't do this, we list the ranch. You agree to that now in this kitchen, or I get back in the rental car and I drive to Denver, and I will not come back, Dad. Not for Christmas, not for your birthday, not ever." Eli looked at his son for a long time. Then he walked across the kitchen past the boy to the table where the notebook lay open. He closed it gently. He set it on the shelf above the stove beside Mirabel's grandmother's coffee pot and Mirabel's grandmother's salt cellar and the small clay sheep Caleb had made in the second grade and his mother had kept for 23 years. 2 weeks, Eli said, agreed. Caleb nodded once, and the work began. It began badly. The first task Mirabel's notebook called for was to drive out to the back pasture into the long sloping draw behind the bluff, where Eli almost never went because the grass was thin and the fencing was old, and to bring in the small flock of crossbred ewes she had been quietly developing for 7 years. There were 62 of them according to her count. Eli had thought there were maybe 40. He had passed the draw 100 times and never bothered to look closely. He had assumed they were culls, the leftovers she kept around, because she could not bear to send them to the sale barn. He had been wrong about that the way he was now beginning to suspect he had been wrong about a great many quiet things. The truck would not start. The battery was dead. He had not driven the old Chevy since the morning of the funeral. Caleb stood in the yard with his arms folded against the cold, watching his father curse the engine. Eli was a man who could rebuild a hay baler with a pocket knife, but his hands would not stop shaking, and the jumper cables he found in the shed had been chewed in two by a pack rat, and somewhere in the chest of him, a knot was tightening that had nothing to do with the truck. Caleb finally crossed the yard. He pulled a small black box out of his coat pocket. He clipped it to the battery. The truck started on the first turn. "Lithium jump pack," he said. "Bought it at the airport in Salt Lake." He did not meet his father's eye. "I figured something out here would be broken." Eli stared at the small black box. He had not known such a thing existed. He had built fences for 40 years using staples he hammered in by hand, and his son had landed in Missoula carrying a battery in his pocket that could start a 1-ton truck. "Thank you," he said. Caleb shrugged. "Get in." They drove out to the back pasture together. Neither of them spoke. The road climbed past the old apple tree Mirabel had loved, and the irrigation ditch that ran down to the creek, and the little wooden bridge Eli's father had built in 1958. And Caleb looked at all of it, the way a man looks at photographs in a stranger's house with polite distance, refusing to let himself remember. The crossbred ewes were exactly where the notebook said they would be. They came down the draw in a long line when Eli called them, and Caleb stood beside the truck with his mouth slightly open, because the wool on these animals did not look like the wool on the others. It was longer, softer. It carried a faint silver sheen in the spring light. It moved like water when they walked. "What are they?" Caleb said. "Half merino." Eli said, slowly reading from the notebook, now his finger on the page. "Half something called a cashmere goat cross. She traded for the foundation buck 7 years ago." He squinted at his wife's handwriting. She wrote here she had to drive to Idaho twice and trade a registered border collie pup for the right one. "I never knew where that puppy went." Caleb was quiet a long time. "She really did all this without telling you?" Eli closed the notebook. "She must have known I would have said no," he said. They drove the small flock down to the home pasture together, the truck creeping along behind the sheep. Caleb walking on the left flank, Eli on the right, neither one of them admitting that they were working easily side by side for the first time in over a decade. The dogs ran the wings. The afternoon light came down through the cottonwoods in long, slow bars, and when they got to the home gate and turned the ewes through, Caleb said, almost to himself, almost without meaning to, "She always did think 3 moves ahead of you." Eli said she always did think 3 moves ahead of everyone. That evening, Eli drove alone into the foothills west of Hamilton, up a county road that gave out into a 2-rut track to find a man named Wendell Pryor. He had not seen Wendell in 11 years. Wendell had been Mirabel's teacher when she was 20 years old, and learning to weave at a craft school in Stevensville before she ever met Eli. Wendell was 74, now lived alone in a cedar cabin he had built himself, kept a vegetable garden and 3 goats, and an opinion of most of humanity that he was unwilling to revise. Eli had always been a little afraid of him. Wendell was splitting firewood when Eli drove up. He set them all down. He did not say hello. He looked at Eli across the chopping block, with eyes the color of weathered slate, and he said, "Took you long enough." Eli held out the notebook. Wendell wiped his hands on his jeans. He took the notebook the way a priest takes a chalice. He sat down on the chopping block. He opened it. He turned through the pages slowly in the failing light, and Eli stood there with his hat in his hand and watched the old man's mouth move silently as he read. When Wendell finally closed it, he looked up. "She came to me with this plan," he said, "in 1992. She was 22 years old. She had just married you. She said she wanted to weave a life that did not depend on any man's permission, including yours. I told her she would have to wait for the right moment. I told her the moment would come, but she might not recognize it, and she would have to trust her hands when it did." He paused. "I did not think the moment would be the one where she was not here to weave it." Eli could not speak. He stood there with his hat in his hand. "I will come down off this mountain," Wendell said. "I will come help you for as long as my legs hold out. I will not take any money. I will eat at your table, and I will sleep in your barn. I am doing this for her, Eli, not for you." He stood up from the block. "But I will tell you something else since we are speaking plainly. I have watched you for 30 years. You are a stubborn man and a quiet one, and you have hidden behind your shears your whole life. If you want to finish what she started, you will have to learn to do a thing you have never done." He paused, and his eyes were not unkind. "You will have to ask for help, out loud, from people, by name." Eli put his hat back on. "I'll try," he said. Wendell came down off the mountain the next morning in a 1974 Ford pickup with a homemade wooden camper on the back. He brought a tool roll, a sack of dried beans, 2 jars of honey, and a wooden case full of weaving shuttles older than Eli. He set up a cot in the corner of the dye house. He moved Mirabel's bench an inch to the left so he could sit on her stool without disturbing the indentation she had left in the wood. He treated the studio the way a man treats a chapel. Caleb watched all of this from the kitchen window with an expression Eli could not read. The first attempt to spin yarn on the old wheel was a disaster. Eli's hands were too rough. The fleece slipped. The single broke 12 times in 20 minutes. Wendell did not scold him. He simply took the wheel back, spun a perfect length in 30 seconds without seeming to look at his hands, and then handed it back. "Try again," he said. "Your wife learned this in 3 weeks. You are a smarter man than you let yourself be." Caleb on the third day came out to the studio with his laptop. He had been on the phone all morning to Denver settling something with his job. He sat on an overturned crate by the door, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "If you actually do this, Dad, you'll need a website. You'll need photographs. You'll need a story. You'll need a brand." He paused. "I can build all of that. It's the one thing I'm actually good at." He did not look up from the screen. "I'm not saying I'm staying. I am saying I will build it before I go." Eli sat at the spinning wheel with a half-finished length of gray yarn in his fingers. "Thank you, son," he said. That was the first crack. Neither of them spoke of it. But the next morning, Caleb was at the kitchen table at 5:30 with a cup of his mother's coffee, sketching out a logo on a yellow legal pad, and he did not leave the table until noon. The community began to arrive in small, almost invisible ways. Eli did not understand at first that it was happening. He noticed only that one morning there was a stack of clean burlap sacks on the porch that he had not put there. The next afternoon, a hand-lettered card appeared in his mailbox with no return address, containing a check for $200 and the words "for feed from a friend of Mirabel's." A teenage boy he half recognized from the Methodist youth group showed up on a Saturday with a post-hole digger and worked the south fence line for 6 hours without taking a break. And when Eli tried to pay him, the boy said, "Pastor Eunice already paid me, sir, in pie. And please don't tell my mother I miss church." Pastor Eunice Marlowe herself appeared on the porch one Wednesday evening with a casserole and a binder. The binder contained the names and telephone numbers of every shop owner she knew from Hamilton to Bozeman who might be interested in carrying small batch yarn. She had also written in her neat schoolteacher hand 3 lines beneath each name describing what kind of person ran the shop and what kind of story they would respond to. "Mirabel and I worked on this list together," she said, settling herself into the kitchen chair as if she had been doing it for years. "About 4 winters ago. I think she was hoping she would never have to give it to you." She paused, looking at him over her glasses. But she also knew Eli that one day she might. "So here it is. Don't waste it." Eli took the binder. He set it on the table beside the notebook. He did not trust his voice. A man named Hollis Rourke, who ran the small feed store in Darby and had owed Mirabel a favor since 1998 that Eli had never known about, called the house on a Friday morning and said he had heard Eli was short on hay. He had 200 bales he was going to have to sell anyway before the rats got them. He could let them go for half the going rate. Cash on delivery, but he was willing to deliver. He could be there Saturday. Eli stood in the kitchen with the phone against his ear, and he closed his eyes. "I'll take them, Hollis. Thank you. I will pay you in full." He paused. "And tell your wife I'll bring her a skein of yarn when we have one worth giving." There was a small silence on the line. Then Hollis said gruffly, "She'd like that, Eli." Mirabel taught her to knit. By the end of the second week, the studio had a rhythm. Wendell sat at the wheel and spun. Eli sheared and skirted the fleeces in the barn and carried them across the yard in baskets. Caleb worked at the kitchen table on the website on the photography on a spreadsheet that he kept showing his father with a kind of quiet, stubborn pride. They had produced 11 skeins of yarn in a color Wendell called River Silver and 23 skeins in a deep madder red Mirabel had named in the notebook Blood of the Mountain. The yarn was beautiful. Even Caleb said so, and Caleb did not say things he did not mean. Eli thought for the first time that they might survive. That was when the inspector came. His name was Marvin Trask. He worked for a regional office of the United States Department of Agriculture out of Helena. He arrived on a Tuesday at 10 in the morning in a white sedan with a clipboard, and he announced that an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging that Stillwater Fold was processing wool products for interstate sale without proper licensing and outside the approved channels of the Regional Wool Growers Cooperative. Eli stood on the porch and listened. He did not let his face change. "I have the right," he said quietly, under the Wool Products Labeling Act of 1939 and the small farm exemptions of the 1972 amendment to shear, process, and sell fleece from animals raised on this land. "I do not need the cooperative's permission. I do not need your permission. My wife studied this law for 30 years. I have her notes inside if you would like to read them." Marvin Trask was a decent man. He spent 2 hours going through the studio with a slow, careful eye. He examined the dye buckets. He examined the labels Caleb had begun to print. He examined the small handwritten sign Mirabel had nailed above the doorway 19 years ago, which said in her own hand, "Wool from this farm, dyed by these hands, sold to those who care." When he was finished, he closed his notebook and he said, "You're inside the law, Mr. Halverson. Barely in some places, but inside." He paused at the door of his sedan. He looked at Eli over the roof of the car. "Whoever filed the complaint, sir, knew exactly where to send me. And they wanted you to know that they knew." He nodded once. "Good luck to you." He drove away. Eli stood in the yard for a long time after the dust had settled. Caleb came out of the studio and stood beside him. "Coltrane," Caleb said. "It wasn't a question." Eli nodded once. "He's not done. He's not." The first finished batch went out on a Friday morning. 60 skeins hand-tied with a small paper label Caleb had designed, packed in a cardboard box addressed to a high-end yarn shop in Bozeman called The Standing Stone. The shop owner had spoken to Pastor Eunice and had agreed to a wholesale price of $190 a skein, with the right to sell at retail for $340. Eli loaded the box into the truck himself. Caleb rode along. Wendell stayed at the studio with the kettle on. The shop was on a quiet street off Main. The bell above the door rang the way bells in such shops always ring, gentle and a little surprised. The owner, a woman in her 60s with white hair and a turquoise pendant, opened the box on the counter and lifted out the first skein and held it in her hands a long time without speaking. She rubbed it against her cheek. She smelled it. She unwound a small length and held it up to the light. She said very softly, "This is the finest yarn that has come into this shop in 12 years. She wrote a check on the spot for the entire box and asked when she could expect the next one. In the truck on the way home, Caleb did not speak for almost 20 miles. Then he said, without looking at his father, "I called my supervisor last night. I asked for a leave of absence through the end of summer. They said yes." Eli kept his eyes on the road. The Bitterroot River ran along the highway on their left, silver and full from the snow melt. "I am glad to hear it, son," he said. Caleb said nothing, but he reached over and turned up the radio, and a song came on that Mirabel had liked, and neither of them changed the station, and they rode home that way through the long blue afternoon with the windows cracked and the smell of the river coming in. That night in celebration, Eli built a fire in the pit behind the studio. Pastor Eunice came. Wendell came down from the cot in the dye house. Hollis Rourke came with his wife, who brought a peach cobbler and a small finished knitting project she had been working on in secret to surprise the new business. 3 other neighbors arrived who had not been invited but had heard. Caleb laughed once at something Pastor Eunice said. Eli could not remember the last time he had heard his son laugh. He went into the house just after 10 to fetch another pot of coffee. He stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the small fire and the small group of people gathered around it, and he thought very simply, "Mirabel, you would have liked this." Then he heard the sound. It was not a normal sound for that hour. It was a high, panicked, broken bleating coming from the lambing pen down by the barn, and it was joined almost immediately by the wild barking of the dog Caleb had left tied beside the porch, and by a second bleat, and then a third, and then a fourth. Each one cut short in a way that no honest predator made an animal sound. Eli set the coffee pot down. He walked very quickly to the back door. The hired dogs in the kennel were now all barking. The fire in the pit had gone silent. Wendell was already on his feet looking toward the barn. Caleb was reaching for the flashlight on the porch rail. And then over the noise of the dogs came another sound, a single sound that did not belong on a Montana ranch on a spring night. It was the sharp metallic snap of wire cutters closing on a fence line, followed an instant later by a long, low, gravelly snarl from somewhere out in the dark beyond the lambing pen, where the predator deterrent fence was supposed to be standing, and was not. Eli reached above the door for the rifle. The first coyote came out of the shadows at the corner of the barn at a dead run, and behind it in a line that stretched back into the dark like a moving black rope came the rest of the pack. The first coyote went down before it reached the lambing pen. Eli had been a marksman before he was a husband, and his hands, which had been trembling for 3 weeks at every other small task, did not tremble now. He fired once. The animal dropped. He fired again. The line behind it broke and scattered, but not all of it. 2 of them had already slipped through the cut fence on the south side and were inside the pen with the ewes. And the bleating coming up from the dark had changed in pitch from fear to something older and more terrible. "Caleb," he said, "flashlight, with me. Wendell, get the women into the house." Caleb did not hesitate. He had not held a rifle in 12 years, but he took the second Winchester down from the rack on the porch, the way a man takes down something his father once taught him to hold, and he ran behind Eli toward the pen with the beam of the light jumping wild on the ground in front of them. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Caleb's life. He would remember them later in pieces. He would remember the smell of the wool when fear changed it. He would remember the white shine of a ewe's open eye in the flashlight beam. He would remember the way his father moved without panic among the animals, talking to them in a low voice the boy had not heard since he himself had been small and feverish in the back bedroom. There now, easy, mother, easy." He would remember firing the rifle himself for the first time since he was 19 years old. The kick of it against his shoulder, the way the recoil rattled something loose in his chest that he had been holding tight for 5 years. When it was over, the surviving coyotes had melted back into the dark. 8 lambs were dead. 2 ewes were badly torn. The big Huey Constance, the one Eli had pulled the tick from on the morning Caleb had come home, was standing in the center of the pen with her wool full of blood, and a lamb of her own born sometime in the chaos alive on the ground at her feet. Caleb sat down in the wet straw, the rifle across his knees. He did not cry. He had not cried at his mother's funeral. He had not cried in the kitchen the night he arrived. But he sat in the straw of his father's lambing pen at 1 in the morning, under a Montana spring sky full of stars, and his shoulders shook the way Eli's had shaken at the kitchen table. And Eli did not say anything to him. He simply sat down beside his son in the straw and put one arm across his shoulders and left it there. After a long time, Caleb said, "You taught me to shoot when I was 7. I remember. You said never aim at anything you didn't intend to keep. I remember that too." Caleb wiped his face on the sleeve of his father's old flannel shirt. "I intended to keep them, Dad." "I know you did, son." In the silver light, just before dawn, walking the perimeter of the broken fence with Wendell, Eli found what he had expected to find and dreaded finding. Caught on the cut end of a strand of high tensile wire snagged there by someone who had been working too quickly in the dark, was a torn piece of brown leather. It was the corner of a work glove, and stamped into the leather in small block letters were 2 initials, CL. Eli closed his fist around the leather. He did not show it to Caleb, not yet. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat next to where Mirabel had stitched his initials 30 Christmases ago. He walked back to the house without speaking, and he poured himself a cup of cold coffee at the kitchen table, and he sat there until the sun came up over the sapphires and turned the snow on the high peaks the color of new wool. Cassidy Holm came to him 3 days later after the Sunday service at the Methodist Church in Hamilton. She was 34 years old, a lawyer in town, and she had her father's height and her mother's eyes, and Eli had watched her grow up from a distance the way one watches a neighbor's child. She waited for him beside his truck in the gravel lot until everyone else had gone, and she asked him quietly if she could speak with him somewhere private. He took her back to Stillwater Fold. He sat her at his kitchen table. He poured her a cup of coffee from the green enamel pot. She set a folder down between them. "My father," she said, "will not be in this town 6 months from now. I'm going to make sure of it." She kept her hands flat on the folder. "There is something he did in 1989 that I have spent the last 4 years quietly documenting. He defrauded a Salish family out of 200 acres of land north of the river. My mother knew. Your wife knew. My mother died with the secret. Your wife refused to sign the papers and walked away from a very well-paid bookkeeping job to do it." Cassidy lifted her hands from the folder. "That is why she left my father. That is why he never forgave her. That is why he has spent the last 36 years trying in small ways and large ones to break the man she married instead of him." She slid the folder toward him. "Everything is in here. I will testify. I will lose my last name, and I will lose my inheritance, and I will gain something I have wanted since I was 19 years old, which is the freedom to look in a mirror without flinching." She paused. "I am giving you this because Mirabel was kind to me when I was a girl, and because I believe my father is about to do something that will hurt you very badly, and I would like this time to be on the right side of it." Eli looked at the folder. He did not open it. He looked at the young woman across his kitchen table, and he saw for an instant the shape of her mother's face beneath her own. "Your mother," he said quietly. "She and Mirabel used to walk together, down by the river, every Wednesday, for years. I never knew what they talked about." Cassidy's eyes glistened, but she did not let them spill. "They talked about us," she said, "mostly. They talked about you and me and my father." She stood up. She put on her coat. She rested one hand on the back of the chair for a moment. "They talked about a future where one of us was free of him." She paused at the door. "Mirabel told my mother the last time they walked that the moment was almost here. She said the wool would remember what the wire forgot. I never knew what she meant. I think now she meant this." She left. Eli sat at the table a long time. Then he picked up the folder. 2 weeks later, the creek went down. It went down in a way that was not natural for that time of year. Stillwater Creek, which ran along the western edge of the ranch and fed the dye house and the watering troughs and the small spring pond where the lambs drank in the mornings, dropped 4 inches in a single afternoon. By the next day, it had dropped 4 more. By the third day, it was a thin silver ribbon over gravel, and Wendell, walking the bank with his hands behind his back, said in a quiet voice, "Your neighbor has bought himself a headgate up at the divide. He has the legal paper for it. He is dewatering you." Eli stood on the bank of the dying creek and looked at the water that was no longer there. Without water, the dye work stopped. Without water, the lambs would have to be hand-carried to the pond, and the pond was already shrinking. Without water, the merino cashmere flock would have to be sold at a loss before the summer heat came down. Thad Coltrane had found at last the lever Eli could not work around. He had bought a piece of paper, and the paper had taken Eli's water away. Caleb sat at the kitchen table that night with his laptop open and his face drawn and his eyes very bright. He was already typing. He was already calling his old friends. He was already drafting language for an emergency injunction under the Montana doctrine of prior appropriation. He looked up at his father once and said, "Dad, I can fight this in court, but it will take 6 weeks." And we don't have 6 weeks. Eli stood at the window. The notebook was on the shelf above the stove. The folder from Cassidy Holm was beside it. The leather scrap with the initials CL was in the drawer of his desk. He took the notebook down. He opened it to a page he had not yet read closely. There was a small map drawn in the back. A sketch of the ranch with a circle in the upper east corner of the home pasture, far from the creek, and a single line of writing beside it in Mirabel's hand. For the day the water goes. 5 years of egg money and yarn money paid the driller in 2020. He told me the well is good for 90 gallons a minute. I never told you because I did not want you to worry. The pump is in the shed behind the dye house under the canvas. The papers are in the bottom drawer of my sewing chest. Eli, if you are reading this, I am sorry I made you find it alone. Count the sheep backward. Start with Caleb, then the ranch, then yourself. Eli stared at the page until the letters blurred. Then he walked into the front room, where Caleb was still typing on the laptop, and he set the open notebook in front of his son. He pointed to the map. He pointed to the words. Caleb read them. Then he read them again. Then he closed his laptop very slowly, and he looked up at his father. And Eli saw for the first time in 5 years the boy who used to follow him out to the lambing barn at 4 in the morning, in a coat too big for him just to be near. "She drilled a well," Caleb said in a voice he could barely steady. "She drilled a well, and she paid for it out of her own pocket, and she never told either of us." Eli nodded. Caleb sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling. He laughed once very softly, the laugh of a man who has just understood something about his mother that he wished he had understood while she was alive. "3 moves ahead," he said. 3 moves ahead, Eli said. They found the pump where she had said it would be wrapped in canvas oiled ready. They found the well casing where she had marked it on the map, capped neatly under a flat stone Eli had walked past 1,000 times without knowing what was beneath it. Wendell brought a friend named Roy, who knew well pumps. Hollis Rourke brought wire. Pastor Eunice brought sandwiches. 3 teenage boys from the youth group brought their father's tools and stayed 2 days. In 36 hours, the well was running. The dye house had water. The lambs had water. The merino cashmere flock kept its weight. And in the courthouse in Hamilton, Caleb Halverson and Cassidy Holm filed a joint emergency motion that combined a water rights challenge with a 36-year-old fraud complaint. And the county judge, who had once been a deputy when Thaddeus Coltrane's first ranch hand died in a suspicious accident in 1991, signed the temporary order with a hand that was steadier than it had been in a long time. It was not over after that, not all at once. These things never are. But the leash had been cut, and both Eli and Thad knew it. Thad Coltrane came to Stillwater Fold one last time on a still bright morning in October, when the cottonwoods along the lane had gone the color of old brass, and the smell of the dye house was the smell of a tannin bath simmering over a low fire. He did not bring a lawyer. He did not bring his foreman. He drove himself in his pearl-white Lincoln, and he parked at the bottom of the steps, and he got out slowly the way an old man gets out of a car when he has stopped pretending he is not old. Eli met him in the yard. Thad did not speak for a long moment. He looked at the lambing barn. He looked at the dye house with its smoke rising thin and blue against the autumn sky. He looked at the porch where Caleb was sitting with a mug of coffee and a laptop, and a half-finished skein of gray-silver yarn on the railing beside him. He looked at the way the whole place was alive in a small and stubborn way, in a way that did not need him. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and he took out a small object wrapped in a square of white linen. He unfolded it. Inside was a slim silver ring. The metal was tarnished. It was a woman's ring. It was old. She gave this back to me, he said, in 1989. The day she told me she would not work for me any longer, and she would not marry me either. He held it out in the flat of his hand. I have kept it for 36 years. I told myself it was because I was waiting. I know now it was because I was hating. He set the ring on the porch step very gently, like a man laying something down at the foot of a grave. I will sign whatever papers your son and my daughter want me to sign. I will not contest the water claim. I will not contest the rest of it either. He paused. He did not look at Eli. She was right about me. She was right about you. It took me 36 years to understand that, and I am tired, Eli. I am tired of carrying it. He turned. He walked back to his car. He drove away slowly down the long gravel lane, and he did not look back, and Eli did not chase him. When the dust had settled, Eli walked up the porch steps and picked up the small silver ring. He held it in his palm a long moment. Then he carried it into the kitchen, and he set it on the shelf above the stove beside the green enamel coffee pot, and the clay sheep Caleb had made in second grade, and the leather notebook that had begun all of this. He did not put the ring inside the notebook. He laid it on top, the way a man marks a finished page. That winter, the first orders for the spring yarn line went out across 9 states. The studio behind the lambing barn ran a fire in its small stove from dawn until late evening. Wendell took an apprentice, a young woman from Stevensville, who had Mirabel's same patience at a wheel. Caleb moved his work down from Denver and built a small cabin at the south end of the home pasture, close enough that he could walk to the kitchen for coffee every morning, far enough that he had his own door. Pastor Eunice came on Sundays for stew. Hollis Rourke's wife learned to dye with onion skins. The Stillwater Fold label began to appear in shops in Portland and Asheville and Brooklyn, and once in a small advertisement in a knitting magazine that came in the mail, in a paragraph that began with the words from a small ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, where a widower and his son weave by hand. On a clear evening late in October, Eli sat on the porch in his coat. The sun was going down behind the sapphires. The air smelled of wood smoke and lanolin and the last warm grass of the year. Caleb was inside the kitchen with Wendell laughing at something. The lead US bell rang once down by the barn. The dog at Eli's feet sighed in the way old dogs sigh when they are content. Eli took the leather notebook from the shelf, and he opened it for the first time to the very last page. He had not let himself read it before. He had been saving it for a night when his hands were steady. The page held only a few lines written in his wife's careful hand on the day before her accident, although he had not known it until now. Eli, my love, if you have come this far, then you have done what I always knew you could do and what I never told you I knew. You did not need me to do it. You only needed to believe I had believed in you. I have. I always did. I always will. Count what you have kept, not what you have lost. Start with our son, then the ranch, then yourself. The wool remembers, my love. The wool remembers. Eli closed the notebook. He sat on the porch a long time with the small silver ring beside him on the railing, and the bell of the lead ewe ringing once more in the gathering dark, and the smell of the dye house drifting across the yard like the last good word of an old prayer. The Bitterroot Valley settled into evening around him. The stars came out over the sapphires one at a time, the way Mirabel had once said the stars came out as if someone were lighting candles in a high, quiet room. And he understood, finally, what she had meant by the words on the cover of her book. The words she had pressed into the leather with her own thumb on a winter night more than 30 years ago. A wire is a thing you string between yourself and others to keep what is yours separate from what is theirs. A wire forgets. A wire rusts. A wire breaks in a hard winter. But wool is what the living animal grows from its own body, what passes from one pair of hands to the next, what carries the shape of the hand that spun it long after the spinner has gone. Wool remembers because love remembers. And nothing built out of love is ever truly ended, only carried one skein at a time. By the people who were taught how to hold it, Caleb came out onto the porch and sat down beside his father without speaking. Eli passed him the cup of coffee in his hand. Caleb took it. They sat together in the silence that does not need to be filled, while the bells rang gently in the lower pasture, and the stars rose one by one over the mountains. Tonight, somewhere in your own life, there is a wire that has gone tight around something you love. And somewhere in a drawer you have not opened, or in a voice you have not yet called back, or in a quiet plan someone made for you long before you knew you needed it. There is a length of wool waiting for your hands. What will you choose to count tonight, friend, before you sleep? The things you have lost or the things you have kept? Sleep gently. The fire is still warm. The bells are still ringing in the lower pasture. And the door of Stillwater Fold is open for you any night you need it.